Alright everyone, tonight we're delving into the stark, perilous, and far from glamorous world of medieval hitmen. These elusive figures who threaded through castle corridors and dim alleyways, aiming to reshape history with a blade and a hushed breath. While cinematic portrayals make them seem intriguing, the reality of being a medieval assassin was truly dreadful. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate my content. And do let me know in the comments where you're watching from and your local time. It's always fascinating to see our global audience. Now, dim the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Let's be clear, no one in medieval times woke up thinking, you know what? I fancy slitting a nobleman's throat for a dozen silver coins and the privilege of hiding in a barrel for 3 days. Becoming a killer for hire wasn't a chosen profession. It was more like the final stop on the life took a catastrophic turn express. Most medieval assassins weren't enigmatic solitaries honed in secluded mountain sanctuaries. They were desperate farmers, disgraced soldiers, former thieves with a knack for precision, or individuals so far off society's radar they could dispatch someone and still be overlooked in a census. If you were affluent, you didn't become an assassin, you commissioned one. If you possessed a title, land, or even a single goat, you were in a position of authority. But if you just escaped a debtor's prison, had a reputation for resolving issues, and could slip into a tavern unnoticed, then congratulations. Someone, somewhere, was about to slide a coin pouch across a table and whisper a name. And that name wouldn't be a pleasant one. You weren't asked to eliminate plain old Bob, the quiet turnip farmer. It was typically a corrupt baron, an overly wealthy bishop, or someone guarded by a dozen bodyguards and surrounded by a moat. The compensation? Enticing. The task? Terrifying. Yet, by the time someone considered it, they had utterly nothing left to lose. No family, no prospects, and certainly no dental coverage. Plus, let's not forget the utter lack of job benefits. No pension, no acclaim, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly put up a sign that read, "Discreet eliminations by appointment." You simply had to remain silent, move swiftly, and never, under any circumstances, reveal your profession. Especially not loudly over ale at the local inn. Oh yes, I'm a traveling rug merchant. The stains? Ah, fabric dye. So indeed, no one aspired to be a medieval assassin. They ended up there because the world had chewed them up and spit them out, cloaked and clutching a rusty dagger. You weren't the hero, nor even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone uneasy and likely didn't survive to enjoy the earnings. Let's shatter the first illusion completely. Medieval assassins didn't train by candlelight in some concealed monastery with sagacious mentors and uplifting flute melodies in the background. There was no training montage, no instructor, no motivational speech. Any skills you acquired were learned by sheer survival during your initial attempts. Most assassins weren't seasoned professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the knack for climbing silently without sneezing. If you had military experience, excellent. That meant you knew how to properly wield a knife. If not, well, stabbing someone is quite instinctive, but escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact? That requires skill or luck. Usually, just luck. There were no handbooks, no guild orientations, no safety briefings. You weren't taught how to spot a body double or where nobles kept their private exits. You figured it out while dangling from a windowsill, wondering if you'd once again stumbled into the servants' quarters. Poison? That was purely trial and error, with a strong emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target merely became mildly disoriented and more wary of his soup. Sometimes you drank from the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control hotline. Just hope, herbal guesswork, and a robust constitution. Of course, if you were incredibly fortunate, and I mean lottery winner fortunate, you might have picked up some tricks from thieves or mercenaries. Perhaps an older assassin showed you how to traverse cobblestones without making a sound. But mentorship wasn't standard. It was rare and fleeting because assassins don't retire. They vanish. Weapon training? Forget it. You weren't carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger you'd pilfered from a guard, perhaps a garrote if you were feeling audacious, and whatever else fit under your cloak without jingling. So no, you weren't some enigmatic martial arts grandmaster. You were a person with calloused hands, silent footfalls, and an intensely unhealthy relationship with dark alleys. Success didn't stem from training, it came from survival. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, imperfectly, then disappearing before anyone could sketch your face and post it on a church door. In essence, your education was brutal, pragmatic, and came with zero graduation ceremonies. Just bruises, bloodstains, and the chilling realization that you were utterly alone. Let's discuss your primary motivation for becoming an assassin. Money. Cold, heavy, clinking, wonderfully spendable currency. The promise of it is what drew you into this life. But the reality? You were paid in deception. When someone hires an assassin, they aren't looking for a long-term relationship. They want a one-time service, no documentation, and ideally no witnesses, including you. They'll offer you a pouch of silver, half upfront, half upon completion of the task. That's if they're feeling generous. But here's the catch. When the job is done is code for after we confirm you didn't botch it, or make us look bad, or leave a trail leading back to us, or survive long enough to speak of it. So you perform the deed. You move through the shadows, risk your life, perhaps eliminate a baron in his sleep. It's not pretty, not poetic. And when you return, yes, about that payment, the client absconded, truly sorry. Or worse, they attempt to kill you. A knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. And even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the danger, not for the bloodshed, not for the 3 days you spent concealed in a haystack infested with fleas and moral regret. You receive a handful of coins, a terse nod, and a reminder you were never here. Also, a grim fact. Some contracts were bogus. Political traps. You'd be instructed to assassinate someone dangerous, only to discover it was a decoy surrounded by waiting guards. Congratulations, you've just stumbled into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. And even when the agreement was legitimate, you couldn't exactly go to court and lodge a complaint. Your Honor, I wish to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract. The only court you'd see was the one where you were the defendant. So you learned to take what you could get, demand upfront payment, and absolutely trust no one. Not even the smarmy little scribe who swore this job would transform your life. It did, mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant surviving on broken promises and disappearing before they broke you. So, you've accepted the task. You've been deceived about the compensation. You're probably going to die. Now, let's discuss your equipment. Forget the fantasy novels and stealthy video games. There were no retractable wrist blades, smoke bombs, enchanted daggers, or crossbows that neatly folded into your boot. Your arsenal consisted of whatever you could pilfer, sharpen, or conceal beneath a tattered cloak without making noise. If you were lucky, and I mean, found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe lucky, you possessed a decent dagger. Not ornamental, not curved like a dragon's tooth. Just sharp, hopefully free of rust, and ideally one that didn't reek of your last victim. Poison? It existed, certainly, but it wasn't as elegant as a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable, concocted from plants, minerals, or toad entrails. Some acted instantly, some took hours. Some merely caused your victim to vomit for 2 days then recover, angrier and now highly suspicious of stew. Ropes? Occasionally useful. You could strangle, climb, or bind something with one, but you'd better know how to use it quickly, because nothing ruins the moment like wrestling someone while muttering, "Wait," which not goes underneath again. Bows? Effective, yes, if you owned one, knew how to use it, and weren't attempting to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a floral arranger. Most assassinations were intimate and personal. No time for graceful marksmanship, just swift, silent, and hopefully not messy enough to cause a slip. And you didn't have backups. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well, time to improvise. A slate roof tile, perhaps? A rusty nail? Worth a try. A shoe buckle with malicious intent? Desperate times. You carried your tools hidden in hems, boots, or even inside hollowed-out bread if necessary. And you kept them close, not for safety, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your closest companion, your taskmaster, and your sole retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no tinkering with gear between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed it wouldn't fail you mid-strike, because ultimately, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you, alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to eliminate random drunkards in back alleys. No one paid you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candlemaker. Your targets were significant. Nobles, bishops, military commanders, sometimes even royalty. And these individuals were exceedingly difficult to kill. First, there were the guards. Not one or two, dozens. Armed, armored, and well-fed. Some guarded the front, some the rear. Some simply stood there looking menacing, daring you to make a wrong move. You'd spend days memorizing patrol routes, door creaks, and precisely how many steps it took before the knight with asthma needed a break. Second, there were walls. Castles didn't have welcoming front porches. They had gatehouses, murder holes, and moats teeming with biting creatures. If you didn't tumble into the water, you still had to contend with arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description included maybe flayed for peeking. Third, there were the servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One suspicious glance from you and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm merely the herbalist." Assassins weren't just battling swords, they were battling gossip. And medieval gossip travels at warp speed if it means someone gets to keep their head. And finally, your actual target, paranoid. Rightfully so. These people were surrounded by schemers, relatives vying for their titles, and 36 individuals feigning affection for them. They wouldn't eat without a tester. They wouldn't sleep without 3 locks on their door. Some even slept in decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly game of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you hear they're attending a feast. Yes, they'll be inebriated, but so will you. And you'll still have to bypass the royal guards, 3 dogs, a highly observant jester, and 50 witnesses clutching tankards. Even getting close to your target could take weeks. Posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, hiding in barrels. And when the moment finally arrived, you had one chance. One precise, perfect, silent, bloodless, vanishing into the night opportunity. Or you'd become the next public warning, swinging from the castle gate with a sign that read, "Good attempt." Let's be candid. When you envision a medieval assassin, you likely picture sleek dark robes, leather armbands, perhaps a mysterious hood billowing in the moonlight. Reality? You resembled a sickly goat herder with something to conceal. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly haute couture. You didn't have custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor. You wore whatever you could scrounge. Peasant rags, a monk's habit 2 sizes too large, or the remnants of a guard uniform that definitely still carried the scent of its previous wearer. The objective was to blend in. But blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from old injuries, and had a nervous tic from malnutrition. You didn't appear suspicious because of your cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to conceal a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget masks. There were no Guy Fawkes options. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which was excellent for avoiding conversation but dreadful for attending parties. If anyone inquired about your identity, you had to think quickly, "I'm Brother Tobias. I oversee silent prayer and rooftop maintenance." Even assuming you slipped past the guards, noble households weren't full of simpletons. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially those who fumbled chamber pots and couldn't name the cook's cat. You were always one I'd never seen you before away from being struck down with a candlestick. And if your disguise actually worked, congratulations. You now had to remain in character for hours while pretending not to notice all the very stab-worthy individuals wandering by. Also, wigs? They didn't exist. If you needed to appear older or younger, you were stuck smearing dirt on your face, squinting, and hoping no one got close enough to notice that your beard was affixed with honey. The truth was, your disguise didn't truly protect you. It bought you perhaps 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to be gone, unseen, or remarkably convincing. And if anyone saw through it, well, let's just say no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room wearing a nun's habit and clutching a sword, especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you operated alone. You didn't have a sidekick with a crossbow, a brilliant alchemist in a hidden lair, or a handler who provided coded scrolls and warm encouragement. You had yourself, a rusty dagger, and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could actually rely on. And if there were murmurs of an assassin brotherhood, it was mostly tavern talk fueled by ale and idleness. You were more likely to encounter a ghost than another professional killer who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because in your line of work, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you survived. Every contact was a gamble, every loose tongue a potential noose. Even your client might not know your true name. And if they did, you were already devising your escape. Companionship? Absurd. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade beneath your pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One misstep, one person recognizing you in a marketplace, and your entire existence devolved into a frantic dash for the nearest sore grate. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable. You were that individual who made people vanish. They feared you, or worse, perceived you as a walking liability. No one wanted to share stew with someone whose occupation could attract an angry mob with torches. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't confide in anyone about the difficulty of sleeping after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you discussed your job, people assumed you were either fabricating stories or dangerous, and they weren't mistaken. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At inns, you occupied the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes constantly scanning the entrance. You never drank excessively. You never stayed more than a single night. You didn't utter your name unless someone paid you first. And even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of disappearing. Not just in a crowd, but from every life you never got to live. Let's assume you accepted the mission. You meticulously planned your route. You bribed the correct doorman. You disguised yourself as a remarkably convincing chimney sweep. And then you hesitated. Perhaps the target unexpectedly turned around. Perhaps they were with their child. Perhaps you developed a tremor at the worst possible moment and your knife hand trembled like a terrified squirrel. Guess what? You're now deceased. Because failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a minor reprimand or a poor performance review. It was a public, agonizing, and wildly theatrical death, often involving ropes, fire, wheels, or sharp iron contraptions with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant jeopardizing the entire operation. Your target survived and immediately informed everyone that someone attempted to murder them. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow. You were a wanted man with a detailed description and likely a crude sketch affixed to every tavern wall within 30 miles. And those guards you once sneaked past? Now they're highly motivated. Sometimes it wasn't even your target you had to worry about. It was your client. If you failed, you were no longer an asset. You were a liability. Someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse, speak. The very individuals who paid you would be the first to issue a second contract on your head. And there were no second chances. No apologies. The blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one opportunity, one fleeting moment. And if you squandered it, the best you could hope for was a swift death before anyone discovered who hired you. Failure also brought shame. The silent, humiliating kind. You didn't just fail to kill. You failed to be unseen, to be flawless. And for assassins, perfection was survival. Anything less might as well paint a bullseye on your back and start rehearsing your final words. It didn't matter how many jobs you'd successfully completed before. No one cared that you succeeded a dozen times, because in this profession, you're only as good as your last kill. And if your last kill didn't happen, you'd better start running. So you succeeded. The plan worked. The dagger found its mark. No screams, no guards, just a quiet collapse to the floor and a very important person who was no longer important. Congratulations. Now flee for your life. Because being a successful assassin in medieval times didn't mean sipping wine on a rooftop while the city burned behind you. It meant scrambling through back alleys with someone's blood on your boots and a dog already tracking your scent. There was no victory lap, no post-job celebratory drink with colleagues, no casual debriefing with your client. You didn't even get a moment to admire your work. The instant your blade struck, your new objective became evading everyone who now desired to murder you in increasingly imaginative ways. Guards approaching, doors locked, horses tethered on the opposite side of town. You're probably bleeding. You had to strategize your escape before the kill. Routes, disguises, fallback safe houses. Perhaps a boatman who owed you a favor or at least didn't ask questions, because the city would go on lockdown within minutes. No one wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant closed gates, armed checkpoints, and a dozen enraged men with swords who had all just received your crude sketch and the warning, possibly armed and exceedingly stabby. And let's talk about the client. Assuming they actually intended to pay you, they weren't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you note. They'd likely vanish too, because an assassin who has just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You had proven you could access places others couldn't. So even when you succeeded, you walked away with coin in one hand and a giant target on your back. And what did you gain? A week of sleeping in hovels, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian as you attempted to blend in with monks heading east. Because success didn't guarantee survival. It meant restarting the entire game in a new city under a new identity, with even more people searching for you this time. So yes, you made the kill. Now run like hell. If being a medieval assassin wasn't already sufficiently miserable, impoverished, hunted, and sleeping in places that smelled of goat, you also had to contend with the wonderfully imaginative paranoia of those around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared, they were considered cursed. To the average peasant, you weren't merely a hooded killer. You were some unholy entity who communed with demons and smeared frog guts on your blade beneath a full moon. Why else would you be able to slip past guards and disappear into the darkness? Logic wasn't particularly prevalent back then. But superstition? Oh, that was ubiquitous. Some believed assassins could shapeshift. Others claimed you were invisible unless cleansed with holy water. One widespread tale suggested assassins forged pacts with forest spirits and could inflict death through walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman murmur, "Don't make eye contact. He might hex the infant." Even your tools were suspect. Carrying a dagger? Clearly, it was forged in a cursed smithy. Using poison? That wasn't chemistry. That was sorcery. And you probably stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You'd think this fear might benefit you. After all, people avoided you, right? But the reality was worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate. They don't ask questions. They hurl stones, ignite fires, and scream things like, burn him before he calls down lightning. Your reputation caused people to overreact. The moment someone died unexpectedly, illness, accident, choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, perhaps it was a shadow man. Perhaps it was him. You could be hunted just for existing in the same village as a suspicious death. That meant you had to keep moving. Always. Stay too long and suddenly a priest is ringing a bell while 5 angry farmers wield pitchforks as if they've been waiting for this moment their entire lives. And heaven help you if you were caught with anything remotely unusual. Dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to shout sorcerer and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too cunning, or too swift made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die quickly and preferably by immolation. Ah, poison. The assassin's weapon of refined destruction. A silent kill, no mess, no screams, no steel on bone. Just a sip, a stumble, a sigh, and done. That's the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like attempting to win a tavern brawl with herbal tea and a bad attitude. Firstly, poisons weren't dependable. You didn't have access to purified cyanide or a neat little pill labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, perhaps the occasional toad. You had to gather, grind, and pray. And even then, it might merely give the target a stomachache and a renewed commitment to his anti-assassin guard squad. There was no scientific measurement. You didn't precisely dose. You eyeballed it. A pinch too little and the noble just vomits and cancels dinner. A pinch too much and you die from exposure before the first course is served. Also, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't just waltz in and season the soup with nightshade. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in unnoticed, or worst of all, try to poison a meal that would pass through 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't just consume food. They treated it like a military operation. Meals were tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the jester. By the time the food reached their plate, it had undergone more security checks than a royal wedding. Even assuming you succeeded, you administered the poison. It wasn't detected, and the target actually ingested it. The next phase was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some took days. One moment your mark is chuckling at a joke. The next he's clutching his stomach and demanding to consult his astrologer. And if they survived, guess who they'd blame? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet man with the herbal knowledge and twitchy eyes. So poisoning wasn't efficient. It was perilous, slow, and riddled with variables, none of them in your favor. And if you were apprehended, you didn't get a swift death. You were interrogated with instruments until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the duke to the dog. You'd think that if you successfully altered the course of history by eliminating a tyrant, undermining a royal lineage, or silencing a political threat, someone would recall your name. Nope, you were an assassin. That meant your name was never intended to be remembered. At best, you were a whispered rumor. Some hooded figure, a foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet man who never finished his ale. You might have pulled off the most legendary hit of the century and still ended up as a mysterious death in the official records. In fact, that was the entire point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew who committed the act, the safer they were, and the less likely they were to end up poisoned by their own assassin. So your name was buried the moment the job was done, if you even used a real one. You didn't sign your work. You didn't boast. You didn't keep mementos. You didn't exist beyond the moment of the kill. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a very brief lifespan. And forget about honor. There were no medals for silence. No stone monuments for the man who halted a war with a single dagger in the night. If a noble desired a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. You received a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or if things went truly awry, a head on a spike labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be cursed. You'd become a whispered caution. Don't defy the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? And the man who did it vanished like a phantom. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear, just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark. You were supposed to disappear. And if you lingered long enough to be known, that was a fatal error, because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were expunged. So you survived. You completed the mission. You even managed to get paid. A miracle in itself. Now all you have to do is lie low, keep a discreet profile, and trust that your client will uphold their end of the bargain and safeguard your identity. Right? Wrong. Because in the realm of medieval assassination, there was one rule even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person paying you. Your client, be they a noble, a merchant, or an ambitious bishop with very flexible morals, didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something dreadful accomplished, and you were the sharpest instrument in the shadows. Once the task was complete, you became a liability. You knew too much. You knew who desired whom dead, when, why, and possibly how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their adversaries, but to them. So what did they do? They ghosted you. They denied ever meeting you. Or worse, they dispatched someone else after you to finalize the contract with something sharper than ink. There were even instances where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to do the job and another to eliminate the first one immediately afterward. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared attempt to blackmail a client, threaten to expose them, that was audacious. And also your ultimate mistake. Because powerful individuals in the Middle Ages didn't negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client possessed a shred of honor, a truly rare specimen, you might get paid and left alone. But even then, you'd still have to assume they were observing you from a distance with someone already sharpening steel and memorizing your gait. You were the secret that couldn't speak, the shadow that couldn't remain. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust. Because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be next. Let's assume somehow you defied the odds. You survived the killings, the fossils, the poisonings, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own moral compass. Now what? You retire? Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins didn't have retirement plans. There were no farewell banquets, no tranquil cottages by the sea. No pensions paid in gold coins and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into a peaceful existence. You vanished or you died, often both. The problem was straightforward. You were never safe. Even if you walked away from the profession, your past didn't. You harbored too many secrets in your mind, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And even if no one pursued you, and that's a significant if, you had to live with the constant dread that someone might. That a new assassin, young and eager to prove himself, had just received a contract for a shadowy figure who was once dangerous. So you changed your name again. You relocated to a village where no one asked questions. You feigned a limp, sold herbs, pretended you once worked as a guard. But even then, you didn't sleep soundly. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger beneath the floorboard next to the pouch of coins you never touched because it still smelled of the man you earned it from. And you couldn't even trust yourself. Years of silent assassinations and swift escapes did something to your mind. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. You ceased dreaming because dreaming was perilous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loudly. You lived like a specter pretending to be a human. The truth was, there was no ultimate goal for a medieval assassin. Just a slow, chilling descent into obscurity, always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped into the darkness and no one noticed. And perhaps that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably grasped it. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even particularly lucrative. It was a grim, thankless, brief career, shrouded in blood-stained linen and trailed by a throng of individuals who desired your demise. You wouldn't survive, not a week, perhaps not even a day, because you'd begin with false assumptions. That you'd be sleek, in command, a mere whisper in the dark. But what you'd truly be is cold, hungry, and one poor guess away from the gallows. You'd slip into town, cloak drawn tight, ready for action, only to discover that your target had changed locations. The guards are inebriated but quick to react. And the stable boy you paid for information just betrayed you for a mug of ale and a piece of bread. You'd freeze at the wrong moment, stab the wrong person, get spotted by someone's maid who once saw your face near the chapel. And suddenly you're not a shadow, you're the problem. Then what? You run, but you're unaccustomed to medieval terrain. The mud, the uneven cobblestones, the utterly absurd number of loose chickens in the street. You slip, fall, get tackled by a guard named Thomas who just got dumped and is looking for an outlet. And let's say you survive that. Then you contend with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future. Just whispers, suspicion, and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, concealed behind a false name in a village that still believes in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try, because the assassin's life wasn't cool. It was a cruel mechanism that devoured individuals and expelled nothing but shadows. It offered power without tranquility and purpose without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing awaiting you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question, because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. Before she became the formidable queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a Molossian princess from the rugged, tribal lands of Epirus. Her lineage claimed descent from Achilles himself, and whether or not the blood of heroes truly coursed through her veins, one thing was undeniable. She was not a woman destined for the background of history. From a tender age, Myrtale was immersed in enigma and ceremony. Her upbringing was shaped not merely by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a profound reverence for the ancient gods. She wasn't the kind of princess content with smiling and embroidering tapestries. Instead, she was drawn to serpents, omens, and the fervent rituals of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot under the moonlight, invoking the divine in states of trance. Her connection to the gods wasn't a performance, it was deeply personal. She didn't just worship, she embodied the divine. Ancient accounts, likely penned by men both awestruck and intimidated, suggest she kept sacred snakes in her chambers, even allowing them to coil beside her in bed. Whether this was literal truth or the kind of calumny powerful women often attract, we'll never know. But the story endured. To her allies, it made her divine. To her adversaries, it rendered her perilous. Her true influence began not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but in the flickering light of torches, amidst the hushed whispers of priestesses and the sinuous forms of serpents. She was more than just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something predating politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, ruthless, brilliant, and notoriously lustful, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he encountered more than just a beautiful princess. He met an enigma he found irresistible. Their marriage transcended a mere political alliance. It was a convergence of prophecy and power, and from its very inception, it was replete with omens. Some whispered that lightning illuminated the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamt of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it would become legendary. But one thing is certain. The union of Olympias and Philip didn't just produce a child. It begat Alexander the Great, and she intended to mold his destiny from his very first breath. Olympias' marriage to Philip II was far from the fairy tale one might anticipate for a queen who would one day give birth to an empire. From the outset, it was a volatile blend of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, ruthless, charismatic, and already accumulating wives like trophies, married Olympias around 357 BCE. She was likely still in her teens, but she was far from naive. She recognized in Philip a man whose ambition mirrored her own, and perhaps even a divine counterpart for her spiritual fate. Macedon was hardly an easy kingdom to enter. It was a land of iron and aspiration, where kings fell to cousins and brothers transformed into rivals overnight. Yet Olympias, the priestess of Epirus, entered with her head held high, her gaze already fixed on the crown. Their marriage was turbulent from the start. Philip, for all his political brilliance, was not inclined towards monogamy. He would proceed to marry multiple women, often for alliances, always for power. But Olympias was not one to recede quietly into the shadows. She maintained her own court, cultivated her own alliances, and was known to consult oracles and perform rites to discern her future, and perhaps Philip's fate. Then came Alexander's birth, Even that event was shrouded in celestial drama. Legends recount Olympias dreaming that a thunderbolt struck her womb and that flames danced around her child without harming him. Philip reportedly had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion, yes, a literal lion. Whether they genuinely believed these visions or fabricated them, they certainly behaved as though Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom, but the world. But even as the child was celebrated, fissures in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, particularly his Macedonian bride Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This was more than a domestic dispute. It was an existential threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be considered purer in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct menace to Alexander's future. Olympias perceived this clearly. The palace was not merely a home. It was a battleground, and she would employ every serpent, dream, ritual, and whisper at her disposal to ensure her son was not just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtale. She was Olympias now, and no one would seize her son's throne without facing her fury. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the Macedonian palace in Pella had devolved into a battleground of veiled insults, political maneuvering, and bitter animosities. Olympias wasn't just vying for influence. She was fighting for her very survival. She understood that the court was teeming with vipers, but she was the one who had taught them how to strike. Philip II had begun to distance himself from her. He was campaigning more, drinking more, and perhaps most detrimentally, listening more to his Macedonian advisors. The ultimate blow arrived when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Egyptian Cleopatra. This Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle, Attalus, was one of Philip's most trusted generals. To Olympias, it was not merely betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The marriage ceremony was a catastrophe. At the feast, Attalus, in a drunken stupor, publicly ridiculed Olympias and Alexander, casting doubt upon the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he truly Philip's son, or was he the offspring of a god, as Olympias was fond of claiming? It was intended as an insult, but Olympias embraced the myth. Let them whisper, she thought. Let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias departed Macedon entirely, retreating to Epirus. But her exile was not a defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal. In her homeland, she still held royal standing. She could rally support, sow discord through whispers, and observe as Philip's palace began to crumble from within. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the shockwave. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, precisely as he was poised to invade Persia, just as he was on the brink of crowning himself not merely king of Macedon, but potential emperor of the known world. The question that reverberated through every marble corridor and torchlit hall was the same. Who was responsible? Was it Pausanias, the spurned bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the culmination of court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself? Or, whispered ever so softly, was it Olympias, No one could prove it. No one dared. But many believed it. After all, within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead. Murdered, some say, by Olympias herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon plunged into mourning or confusion, Olympias made her move. While others struggled to comprehend the chaos, she acted swiftly, brutally, decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympias didn't just have her killed. She orchestrated her death to be symbolic, public, and humiliating. Some say Cleopatra was compelled to hang herself after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter. Others claim Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. What is agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood what many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a vulnerability. A rival child, regardless of how young, represents a future conflict. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, she could redirect her attention to securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, and already tutored by Aristotle, was declared king without significant opposition. But do not be deceived. It wasn't solely his charisma or his father's legacy that made it possible. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to intimidate, which nobles to appease, and which enemies to discreetly remove. She wasn't just safeguarding her son's ascent. She was orchestrating it. Alexander himself didn't always condone her methods. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family. But he also didn't intervene because deep down he understood what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood. And in Macedon, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to withdraw slightly from public life. But this was no retirement. She simply transitioned from overt actions to subtle influence. As Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, she remained behind not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual custodian of his destiny. She dispatched sacred relics to him, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. To Olympias, her son's mission was not merely military. It was divine. Alexander wasn't going to war. He was fulfilling prophecy. And as long as she drew breath, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would thwart that divine plan. She had crowned her son. She had purged the palace. Now she would guard his empire from behind the curtain with bared fangs. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained in Macedon, a queen without a throne, but not without power. Her official title was Queen Mother, but make no mistake, she ruled in all but name. Although regency was technically entrusted to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympias refused to be sidelined. She constantly wrote letters to her son, offering advice, warnings, and sometimes reprimands. These were not the sweet letters of a doting mother. They were political dispatches laced with oracles and venom. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every word. She reminded him of his true enemies. She questioned the loyalty of his companions. She criticized his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his dabbling with claiming godhood. No one else dared utter such things to him. But Olympias was never afraid to speak as a mother or as a priestess of divine will. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew increasingly resentful. Olympias undermined him at every turn. She leveraged her status, her religious authority, and her familial connections to incite opposition against him. She wielded influence in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the aristocracy. She could disseminate rumors like wildfire, and with Olympias, a whisper could be more lethal than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander grew more urgent. She cautioned him about Antipater's ambition, portraying him as a second Philip, ready to betray and usurp. Whether she genuinely believed it or simply feared losing her grip, she kept pressuring her son to act. Alexander, however, hesitated. He needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he fought in Asia, and so the chasm between mother and general widened. Olympias watched. She waited, but beneath her religious robes and maternal concern, she was growing impatient. She hadn't endured years of palace warfare only to be governed by an old soldier. As Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to India, Olympias perceived cracks forming. He was undertaking too much, placing trust in too many foreign advisors, and drifting away from the mother and the gods who had made him. She believed his victories stemmed from divine favor and from her. And if he forgot that, well, Olympias knew how to remind kings of their true nature, even if that king was her own son. When news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive like a triumphant trumpet, it arrived like a dagger. For Olympias, it wasn't just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of a world she had spent decades constructing. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, nurtured, and unleashed, was gone. And he had left behind no clear heir, no single successor, only chaos. The mighty empire he had forged was already fragmenting. Generals, his supposed successors, were already carving it up like jackals around a carcass. Antipater still held power in Macedon and Greece, and he harbored no affection for Olympias. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by rival generals for marriage, each hoping to exploit her bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympias foresaw what was coming. Civil war was not a possibility, it was an inevitability. And once again, she would have to act. But she no longer had Alexander. What she had instead was his bloodline. His young son Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxana, still in Macedon, was vulnerable. The boy even more so. Olympias recognized that the infant was now the last true vestige of her son's legacy, making him both a target and a weapon. She allied herself with Roxana and the boy, resolved to protect them and utilize the child's birthright to assert her own claim in the political arena. But the tide was turning. The generals who once bowed to Alexander had no interest in kneeling to his widow or his mother. They possessed armies now, ambitions, and resentments. Olympias did not flinch. She had confronted serpents, traitors, and kings. A few warlords with crowns and stolen spears wouldn't intimidate her. So she plotted. She waited. She watched as Antipater died and was replaced by his son Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and no patience for the old queen's machinations. It was only a matter of time before these two forces clashed, the serpent mother of Alexander and the cold-eyed usurper who desired her demise. Alexander was gone, but his shadow still lingered, and Olympias was still coiled within it, poised to strike. Years after Alexander's death, as his empire fragmented into civil war, Olympias made her most audacious move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force of divine fury. The regency had splintered. Cassander, the son of her old adversary Antipater, was seizing power, and Roxana, along with young Alexander IV, was effectively imprisoned. Olympias saw the impending doom. If she did not act now, her grandson would vanish like a shadow at dusk. So she forged an agreement with Polyperchon, an aging general who still retained a flicker of legitimate authority. Olympias would return not to supplicate, but to rule. With Polyperchon's support, she entered Macedon at the head of an army. And the instant her feet touched her homeland's soil, everything shifted. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected to her side. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympias, despite her age, was still a name that made the earth tremble. Then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted down Cassander's loyalists. And when she finally apprehended Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some accounts, his wife Eurydice was captured and given the option to take her own life. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was brutality cloaked in royal protocol, and Olympias, ever the dramatist, staged the scene like a goddess dispensing justice. Her message was unequivocal. Only the bloodline of Alexander had the right to rule. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief, intense period, Olympias held the kingdom in her grasp. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She had reminded Macedon what royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like fire in dry grass. And Cassander was still at large, calculating, patiently awaiting his moment. He returned with a vengeance. His army outnumbered hers, his resources were deeper, his cruelty colder. Her allies began to desert her. Polyperchon's influence waned. The tide had turned. Olympias, now isolated in the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the fuse. Macedon had burned, and now the smoke hung thick, and her enemies were at the gates. Olympias, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, alone, cut off, surrounded by Cassander's army, who had come to complete what his father had begun. But Olympias did not plead. She did not beg. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food dwindled. Disease crept in. Allies vanished. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unyielding presence that had once intimidated kings. To the very end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew that killing Olympias was perilous. Even now, she was cloaked in myth-like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might be perceived as blasphemy. so he offered her safety. Surrender, he declared, and her life would be spared. Olympias knew better. She had witnessed too many royal promises crumble to dust. Still, hunger was no longer just discomfort. It was death. Her garrison broke. Her followers surrendered. And Olympias, unyielding until the very end, was finally delivered to her enemies. Cassander did not kill her himself. That would have been too simple and too merciful. Instead, he handed her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here's the extraordinary detail. When the executioners arrived, no one dared strike the first blow. Olympia stood tall, regal, silent, her eyes fixed on them like an oracle gazing through smoke. These were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing tales of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god. And now here she stood, a frail old woman shrouded in myth. And not a single man had the courage to wield the sword. So Cassander dispatched others, foreigners, outsiders, people who had no memory of her power, only orders to obey. And thus, Olympias was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline holding any significant power. And with it, the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was extinguished. But even in death, Olympias left a lingering shadow. And history would never forget the Serpent Queen. Olympias died not on a throne, but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once governed. But history is peculiar. It does not always favor those who die in silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing. And Olympias was never destined for quiet history. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword and prophecy like a shield. She wasn't merely the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the architects of his ascent. Without her, there is no myth of the divine child, no rituals whispering of thunderbolts and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire. She defended it with claws. Yet even among the ancient world's most ruthless dynasts, Olympias stands distinct. She didn't command armies in the field like Cleopatra or ride into battle like Boudica. Her battlefield was more subtle and colder. It was a realm of poisoned goblets, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She comprehended the power of fear, and even more significantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and she may have believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they were not incorrect. Olympias was all those things and more. She was the product of a brutal world that valued cunning far more than kindness. And she learned early that mercy was a luxury queens could not afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both demonized and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary. But no historian, ancient or modern, could deem her irrelevant. She haunted Alexander's legacy like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain. And perhaps that is precisely where she belonged. Not as a tragic mother or a mere footnote in a king's story, but as a narrative unto herself. The woman who draped herself in prophecy, slept beside snakes, and outlived gods. Olympia's bones turned to dust long ago, But her legend endures in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-borne destiny, in every empire built on myth. She is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting. On the sun-drenched island of Crete, a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more like a dream than a tangible place. Stone corridors meander in all directions. Rooms twist and double back. Staircases lead to nowhere. It's easy to lose your bearings even today. This site is Knossos, the heart of Minoan civilization and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in human history, the labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a palace. A palace unlike any other. Constructed around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, Knossos was not merely a royal abode. It was an entire city under one roof. Spanning nearly 150,000 square feet, it boasted over 1,000 rooms, light wells, storage magazines, shrines, workshops, and what may have been the first flushing toilets in history. It featured running water, multi-story dwellings, and an intricate system of air circulation. This was no rudimentary fortress. It was an architectural marvel. To modern archaeologists, Knossos appears as organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it likely felt like magic. The individual who brought Knossos to modern awareness was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans excavated the site and swiftly became convinced that this was the origin of the Greek labyrinth myth. The layout was disorienting, the architecture profoundly symbolic, and everywhere he explored, he discovered motifs of bulls, painted on walls, carved into stone, or sculpted into tiny golden charms. The bull, after all, was sacred to the Minoans. Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the mythical King Minos. Whether Minos was a real figure or not, his legend became inextricably linked with the ruins. But here's the unexpected turn. No one has uncovered a literal labyrinth. No underground maze, no prison chambers, no half-human monster. What we possess instead is something far more enigmatic. A city designed in loops, wings, and layers, deliberately challenging to navigate. And the deeper one delves, the more the boundaries between history and mythology blur. So the question persists. Was the Minotaur born from these walls, or was the palace itself the monster? Knossos may not readily yield its answers, but it excels at prompting the right questions. The myth is as renowned as the ruin. A monstrous half-man, half-bull imprisoned in a labyrinth so intricate that no one who entered ever found their way out. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, managed to slay the beast and escape, thanks to a ball of thread and the ingenuity of Princess Ariadne. But whence did this tale originate? And why a labyrinth? The earliest versions of the myth speak of King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, who demanded tribute from Athens in the form of 7 boys and 7 girls each year. These unfortunate souls were fed to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine retribution and disgrace. The Minotaur, confined within an underground maze, symbolized the dark underbelly of power, something savage concealed beneath grandeur. To ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of prosperity, mystery, and apprehension. Its seafaring people, the Minoans, were perceived as both elegant and alien. Their rituals involved bull leaping, their artwork depicted unusual gods, and their palaces were unlike anything on the mainland. To a visiting Greek from 1000 BCE, Knossos might have felt like another realm. The bull itself was sacred in Minoan culture. Frescoes illustrate young men and women vaulting over charging bulls in ritualistic displays. Horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, adorn rooftops and altars. Combine this with a palace that feels like a maze, and the ingredients for a legend begin to coalesce. But what if the Minotaur was more than just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars posit that the tale reflects a memory of Cretan dominance over the Aegean, a period when Athens truly did pay homage to a stronger, stranger power. The labyrinth could symbolize the political entanglement of weaker states, and the Minotaur the raw, terrifying force behind Minoan rule. Others contend it's more psychological. The labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden impulses, and Theseus the hero bravely venturing into the darkness, guided solely by the thread of memory. Still, the myth remains intertwined with Knossos. The palace is the closest approximation we've discovered to a real labyrinth. No monster, no Ariadne, but perhaps something more profound. Not just a myth echoing through history, but a history that yearned to become myth. Long before Athens erected its marble temples or Sparta honed its spears, there existed the Minoan civilization, one of Europe's earliest advanced societies. They reigned not through conquest, but through trade, art, and what appears to be an almost supernatural mastery of architecture. At the core of their power stood Knossos, a palace that was not merely a royal seat. It was a nexus of culture, ritual, and economy. The Minoans flourished from approximately 2600 to 1400 BCE. Based on Crete, they cultivated an expansive trade network that extended to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Spain. Their ships traversed the Mediterranean like silent arrows, transporting pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxury goods. They didn't construct vast armies. They forged relationships, and that, more than weaponry, brought them wealth. What is most striking about Minoan culture is its distinctiveness from their later Greek successors. Their artwork celebrated nature, animals, and fluid human movement, not warfare or divine retribution. Frescoes depict dancers, dolphins, and athletes vaulting over bulls. Even their goddesses are unique, powerful, bare-breasted figures often holding snakes, symbols of fertility, transformation, or protection. At the center of it all was Knossos, not a hilltop fortress, but a complex nestled in a fertile valley. It lacked massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt secure on their island or projected enough power to render defense unnecessary. Their confidence was architectural. Multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems hinted at a society far ahead of its time. And yet, for all their sophistication, the Minoans left behind no deciphered written records. Their primary script, Linear A, remains indecipherable to this day. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what their kings believed, what prayers they uttered, or what truly transpired within the walls of Knossos. All we have are their ruins, their art, and their influence, later absorbed by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just builders of palaces, they were architects of mystery. And Knossos was not merely a building. It was the pulsating heart of a civilization that shimmered for a moment like sunlight on the Aegean, and then vanished. But some say their echo still roams the maze. To wander through Knossos is to journey through time. Layered, perplexing, beautiful time. It's not just the scale that overwhelms you, it's the design. Rooms lead into rooms. Corridors bifurcate and disappear. Light wells pierce the heart of the structure. Stairs spiral into shadows or abruptly emerge into sunlit courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight line. It's not difficult to understand why ancient visitors might have whispered labyrinth. Knossos was not merely a palace, it was a living entity, spanning an estimated 150,000 square feet. The complex comprised over 1,000 chambers, some diminutive, some grand. These were not randomly placed rooms. They were purpose-built workshops, storage areas, shrines, apartments, and throne rooms, all arranged around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or bull-leaping rituals. The palace was constructed on multiple levels, reaching up to 4 or 5 stories in some areas, utilizing natural slopes and artificial terraces. To navigate it without getting lost, one would require memory, instinct, or a thread like Theseus. And yet, this apparent disarray conceals a remarkable intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air shafts and open stairwells. They channeled rainwater through clay pipes and possessed toilets that flushed long before Rome popularized the concept. One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the alabaster chair built into the wall, flanked by benches. Around it are frescoes of griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess's chamber, a sacred court? No one knows for certain. And the walls, they speak in color. Vibrant frescoes depict dolphins swimming above bathtubs, women in elegant flounced skirts with bare chests, youths leaping over bulls mid-air. The art was not merely decorative, it was identity, fluid, natural, deeply connected to earth and sea. Still, the deeper you venture, the more Knossos begins to disorient. Some sections appear intentionally complex, as if designed to confuse. Perhaps that is the origin of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive, a building that inspired awe, ritual, and just a touch of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts. Just a place built to make you question your location and what awaited around the next corner. Knossos was not just an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan soul, steeped in ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there are no towering columns to Zeus or marble shrines to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos is more subtle, woven into the very fabric of the building. Shrines are concealed in corners. Pillars rise like sacred sentinels. Horns, stylized, carved, symbolic, appear on rooftops and altars. Everywhere you look, the bull motif predominates, suggesting a powerful connection between worship, the natural world, and this revered animal. The Minoans did not appear to fear the bull, they celebrated it. The famous bull-leaping fresco in Knossos is not just athletic art. It may depict a religious rite. Young men and women vaulting over a charging bull, locked in a dance of peril and grace. It was not sport, it was sacred theater, possibly an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Hidden beneath the palace at Knossos, snake goddesses were unearthed in storerooms. These figures, among the most recognizable Minoan artifacts, are iconic. With bared breasts and arms raised, serpents coiled in their grasp or around their forms, they exude power. Far from being submissive idols, They served as protectors of the home, fertility, and potentially life itself. For the Minoans, snakes embodied renewal, rebirth, and enigma, creatures of both the earth and the underworld. The spaces where these artifacts were found suggest household shrines or ceremonial areas, quiet, sacred nooks nestled within the vibrant heart of the palace. When viewed alongside the frescoes, the horns, the altars, and the intricate corridors, the entire complex begins to feel like a ritualistic engine, a structure designed not merely for habitation but for communion with the divine. Knossos lacked a central temple because the palace itself functioned as a sanctuary. Its layout, artwork, and architectural design were all integral to a spiritual perspective where the lines between the sacred and the secular blurred. This was a place where myth was woven into the very architecture, where a hallway could become a conduit to the gods, and where every resonance within the stone chambers might once have been a murmured prayer. Knossos wasn't just a dwelling for people, it was a dwelling for deities. For centuries, Knossos shone as a beacon of prosperity, innovation, and cultural refinement. Yet, an abrupt and inexplicable event occurred. By approximately 1400 BCE, the palace lay deserted, its frescoes left to decay, and the Minoan civilization that once held dominion over the seas vanished as if swallowed by the Aegean mist. What transpired? Numerous theories exist. Some attribute it to natural forces. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, now known as Santorini, experienced one of the most cataclysmic eruptions in human history. The immense force of the blast likely triggered tsunamis that ravaged Crete's northern coast, obliterating ports and agricultural lands. Volcanic ash clouds may have obscured the sun, decimating crops and disrupting the climate. While Knossos was not immediately obliterated, the aftermath of the eruption may have destabilized its foundations economically, politically, and spiritually. Others point to conflict. By 1450 BCE, the burgeoning power of the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, may have exploited Minoan vulnerabilities. Archaeological evidence indicates a brief reoccupation of Knossos, but the culture had undergone a transformation. The art adopted a more militaristic theme, and Linear A, the Minoan script, was supplanted by Linear B, utilized by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with images of snake goddesses and bull dancers now echoed with a foreign tongue. Some scholars posit that the Mycenaeans did not launch a single conquering invasion, but rather gradually assimilated the island, first through commerce, then influence, and ultimately dominion. Others contend that internal collapse, a civil uprising, political instability, or the failure of the elite may have been equally significant contributing factors. What is striking, however, is the scarcity of violence evident in the ruins. There are no charred remains, no indications of widespread slaughter. Knossos did not fall with a cry, it faded with a murmur. The grand palatial system simply ceased to function. The chambers grew silent, the rituals ceased, and nature gradually reclaimed its territory. By the time Homer recounted tales of Crete in his epics, Knossos was already an ancient legend, a memory interwoven with stories of monarchs, monstrous beings, and labyrinths. And perhaps that is fitting, for what ultimately brought down Knossos was not merely an eruption or an invasion, but the passage of time and the inevitable way all magnificent creations, no matter their beauty, eventually succumb beneath the weight of new empires. Yet, its essence remains. And if one listens intently, the intricate structure still resonates beneath the earth. For millennia, Knossos lay buried beneath the soil of Crete. Just another forgotten mound of stone, its name erased, its myths distorted, its walls consumed by olive groves and dust. That is, until one individual resolved to pursue a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he didn't merely unearth Knossos, he resurrected it in his imagination. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for the dramatic and a profound admiration for Homeric mythology, acquired the land covering the ancient ruins. Local farmers had been discovering unusual seals and artifacts, clues hinting at something monumental hidden beneath their feet. Evans commenced his excavation. What he uncovered would forever alter the history of the Aegean. He unearthed a palace so expansive, so intricate, and so advanced that he became convinced it was the fabled residence of King Minos. The frescoes, the horns, the sheer architectural peculiarity of the site, all pointed, in his view, to a single conclusion: the labyrinth. Evans was more than just an archaeologist. He was a narrator, and at times, a contentious one. He christened the people who constructed Knossos the Minoans, in homage to Minos. He interpreted symbols, painstakingly reassembled frescoes, and restored portions of the palace using reinforced concrete, a decision that has garnered both acclaim and criticism. Some hail it as visionary, while others denounce it as desecration. For what stands at Knossos today is a fusion of ancient remains and Edwardian interpretation. Nevertheless, Evans accomplished what no one else had dared. He breathed life back into Knossos. He offered Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age civilization far more ancient than classical Greece, a culture of artistry, enigma, and maritime sophistication. He also unearthed the still undeciphered Linear A script, raising new questions about language, literacy, and the limitations of our historical comprehension. But Evans did more than merely excavate stone. He revived a myth, and compelled historians to confront the reality that behind the legend of the labyrinth lay something tangible, something complex, something profoundly human. A palace that felt like an intricate puzzle, a civilization that receded into obscurity, and a man who stripped away the earth only to reveal a narrative far more extraordinary and captivating than he had ever conceived. Knossos had slumbered for 3 millennia. Evans was the one who awakened it. Wandering through Knossos today isn't just traversing architecture, it's navigating a lexicon of symbols. Frescoes, carvings, and patterns are ubiquitous. However, the Minoans left us no Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, Linear A, remains a mystery. Consequently, instead of deciphering their thoughts, we must perceive them emblazoned across plaster, etched into walls, and concealed within designs. What exactly were they endeavoring to communicate? The art of Knossos is unlike anything else found in the ancient world. There is no preoccupation with conflict, no depictions of kings in rows or battle-hardened heroes. Instead, we encounter nature, leaping dolphins, blossoming lilies, birds in flight, and sacred bulls. The human figures are dynamic, graceful, and frequently shown dancing or engaging in rituals. Even in scenes that hint at peril, there is a sense of rhythm and elegance. The Minoans were not chronicling conquests. They were celebrating life cycles and possibly the cosmic order. The most emblematic symbol, however, is the double axe, or labris. Found throughout Knossos in shrines, on frescoes, and even incised into stones, The double axe is believed to be a religious emblem, potentially linked to female divinity or celestial cycles. Some propose that the very word labyrinth might derive from labries, thus making the labyrinth not a maze at all, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a snare. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns positioned atop walls and altars. These may have served as religious markers, delineating sacred space from the mundane. Combined with frequent portrayals of bulls and bull-leaping rituals, it is clear the animal held profound spiritual significance. Whether it symbolized nature, fertility, chaos, or a divine presence remains a matter of debate. But the bull is omnipresent. Even the layout of Knossos itself may carry symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was constructed not solely for practical purposes, but to reflect celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding passages and interconnected rooms could represent a journey through life, through death, through the underworld, a spiritual labyrinth, not a physical confinement. Yet, without a deciphered script, every theory treads a fine line between understanding and conjecture. The Minoans communicated through symbols, not narratives. And so, we are left to interpret. What is Knossos conveying? We discern the rhythms, we observe the images, but the true meaning remains just beyond our grasp, like a thread unraveling into myth. Knossos is a ruin, undeniably, but it does not feel lifeless. Walk its corridors today, and you will perceive a subtle resonance beneath the surface. Not specters, not deities, but echoes of myths, of lives lived, of questions that stubbornly persist. Thousands of years after its decline, Knossos still enthralls us in its intricate design. Tourists wander its halls, archaeologists seek answers, and writers weave new tales inspired by its enigmatic aura. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the sensation of the labyrinth is palpable. The identities of those who govern Knossos remain unknown. We do not know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We are unaware of the prayers they murmured or the laws they abided by. But we do know they cherished beauty. We know they revered nature. We know they comprehended the harmony between architecture and art, between ritual and reality. And we know they were the Genesis. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a narrative. For perhaps that is the true essence of the labyrinth. Not a confinement, not a riddle, but a story etched in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur did not emerge from a vacuum. It originated from this place, from the perplexity of its passages, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the awe it inspired in generations who sought to comprehend it. The Greeks transformed it into a story. We transformed it into archaeology. But at its heart, Knossos has always been both. Today, we can traverse its ruins in broad daylight. We can capture images, create diagrams, and even reconstruct its frescoes. Yet the enigma has not dissipated. The boundary between fact and legend still shimmers like heat radiating from stone. Perhaps that is why Knossos endures, because it does not provide all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history is not meant to be deciphered, but to be experienced. And Knossos, ancient, intricate, partially recalled, is not merely a location on a map. It is an inquiry, one that draws us deeper with every stride. And like Theseus, we are all still pursuing the thread. Ancient engineers possessed precise knowledge of their craft. The earliest battering rams were wielded by hand. Squads of soldiers simply lifted a tree trunk and slammed it against enemy defenses like frenzied woodsmen. Over time, however, the battering ram underwent a transformation. Engineers recognized that mounting the ram within a wheeled framework, often with a protective roof to shield the crew from arrows and boiling oil, elevated it from a mere implement to an instrument of terror. The Assyrians, masters of siege warfare, turned rams into psychological weapons. Their siege towers combined rams with platforms for archers, meaning a city's gates were being destroyed while defenders endured continuous barrages. Relief carvings from Nineveh depict rams with sharpened iron tips, advancing towards the gates of rebellious cities like slow-moving embodiments of destruction. And they weren't only targeting the main entrance. Rams were frequently employed to exploit weak points in walls, demolish watchtowers, or completely collapse gatehouses. Their presence signaled one grim choice: surrender or witness your fortifications crumble like stale bread. The Greeks refined them, and the Romans brought them to perfection. Roman engineers constructed colossal rams called ares, the Latin word for ram, suspended by chains or ropes within massive siege shelters. Some were so enormous they required dozens of men to operate. The rhythmic sway of their beam was said to echo like thunder rolling across stone. Yet, for all their raw power, battering rams demanded considerable coordination. Operators had to maintain the ram's synchronized swing while also defending it from incendiary projectiles, stones, and all manner of noxious substances hurled from above. A stalled ram was a doomed ram. Still, when a battering ram gained momentum, truly gained momentum, it became unstoppable. Wooden might versus human masonry, it was ancient physics weaponized, and it marked just the beginning of how engineers would make walls yield. If the battering ram was the brute force, the catapult was the strategist. Where rams shattered defenses up close, catapults assaulted from a distance, unleashing not only stones but psychological dread. They represented the first true artillery pieces in military history, and they revolutionized siege warfare by applying physics in ways that seemed almost miraculous to the adversary. The earliest catapults emerged from the Greek world around the 4th century BCE. They were the product of brilliant minds seeking to extend the range and impact of warfare. Dionysius I of Syracuse, a despot with a penchant for advanced weaponry, commissioned the initial torsion-powered catapults, devices that harnessed twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These were not overgrown slingshots. They were precision instruments designed for siege terror. The ingenuity lay in their mechanics. Engineers discovered that by tightly twisting ropes, often crafted from animal sinew, they could store immense amounts of potential energy. When released, this force could propel stones, javelins, or even flaming projectiles hundreds of meters. Two primary types rapidly developed: the ballista, which launched massive bolts like a colossal crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which lobbed boulders over walls or directly at fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers, who had a knack for refining Greek innovations. They built catapults that could be disassembled, transported on carts, and reassembled on site. Mobile siege engines for professional armies. Some Roman catapults could fire 60-pound stones at incredible velocities, capable of tearing through wooden gates, battlements, and occasionally unfortunate soldiers. Catapults were not solely about destruction. They were about spectacle. Ancient commanders employed them to transmit messages, sometimes literally. Corpses were launched over walls to propagate disease and fear. Decapitated heads were flung into besieged cities to shatter morale. In one grim instance, diseased bodies were propelled into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. But catapults had their drawbacks. They were cumbersome, demanded skilled crews, and could be rendered ineffective by challenging terrain. Nevertheless, when properly deployed, they could pummel a city into submission from a safe distance. And for the first time in history, cities realized their thick stone walls needed not only to withstand a ram, they had to survive assaults from above. For now, destruction descended from the sky. If the catapult was shrewd, the trebuchet was majestic. Towering, groaning, and awe-inspiring, it reigned supreme as the king of medieval siege warfare. When one appeared on the battlefield, it was not merely a weapon, it was a proclamation. It declared, "Your walls are futile." Unlike its tension-powered counterparts, the trebuchet operated on the principle of gravity. At its core was a straightforward concept: a long, swinging arm mounted on a robust frame with a heavy counterweight at one end and a sling at the other. Raise the weight, release it, and the arm would whip around, propelling the sling and its lethal payload in a high arc over enemy defenses. It was controlled devastation, precise, predictable, and ruinous. The lineage of the trebuchet can be traced to early traction models used by the Chinese as far back as the 4th century BCE, where human power substituted for counterweights. However, the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would redefine siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe acquired the design, it spread rapidly through castles and crusades. Its power was astonishing. A well-constructed trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. Stones the size of furniture would smash into towers, pulverize walls, or crush enemy morale. But its true brilliance lay in its trajectory. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls with remarkable accuracy. This meant they weren't just demolishing defenses. They were striking courtyards, barracks, and supply depots within the fortifications. And it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets flung everything: diseased animals, flaming pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, even messages or taunts wrapped around rocks. One legendary account from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland speaks of Warwolf, a trebuchet so immense that the enemy capitulated before it was even fired. The king refused to accept the surrender simply so he could test the machine. Yet, despite its destructive grandeur, the trebuchet was not swift. It took hours to construct, minutes to reload, and required skilled engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, force, and psychological dread quite like it. It was the medieval equivalent of a slow-motion hammer descending from the heavens. And when that counterweight dropped, cities held their breath. While catapults launched from afar and battering rams assailed the gates, siege towers adopted a more direct approach. They rolled directly to the enemy's entrance and deployed armed invaders. Imagine a wooden skyscraper on wheels, draped in wet hides to resist fire, bristling with archers and spearmen. That was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier and a mobile fortress combined. And when one of these behemoths began to rumble towards your city walls, you knew the true battle was about to commence. Siege towers were not subtle. They were massive, audacious, and terrifyingly effective when properly utilized. The Assyrians may have been among the first to deploy them in the 9th century BCE, but it was the Greeks and particularly the Hellenistic kingdoms that elevated their design to theatrical extremes. During the Siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian general Demetrius constructed a 9-story tower named the Helepolis, or Taker of Cities. It stood over 100 feet tall, equipped with catapults, covered in iron plates, and propelled by thousands of soldiers. It also buckled under its own weight, but its ambition was unparalleled. The rationale behind siege towers was straightforward. Walls are effective only if they cannot be surmounted. Siege towers negated that advantage by creating an elevated platform from which attackers could descend onto the battlements, bypassing gates and climbing ladders. From the uppermost deck, archers could unleash a hail of death upon defenders, while troops on the lower levels prepared to breach. However, these towers were not invulnerable. They were ponderous, susceptible to mud, and prime targets for defenders armed with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even sabotaged terrain. Astute defenders would dig trenches, flood moats, or construct secondary inner walls known as counterscarp defenses solely to impede a tower's advance. Nevertheless, when they succeeded, they did so spectacularly. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own ramparts suddenly swarming with enemy soldiers, that was pandemonium. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal struggle of strength to a vertical race for survival. They rendered height both an asset and a vulnerability. And once the gangplank dropped from a siege tower to the city walls, there was no retreat. It was time for close quarters mayhem. While rams crashed and trebuchets soared, some of the most devastating siege tactics unfolded silently beneath the ground. Siege tunneling, or sapping, was the insidious art of conquering a city by removing the very earth it stood upon. Literally, the concept was ancient and terrifyingly effective. Dig beneath the enemy's wall, support it with wooden props, then ignite those supports. When the timbers burned away, the tunnel collapsed, bringing the wall's foundation down with it. One moment your city stood strong, the next a massive section of the outer wall crumbled like stale bread. This method lacked grandeur. There were no magnificent engines or thundering launches. But tunneling was the slow, unseen assassin of fortress warfare. The Assyrians employed early forms of it, but the technique reached its full sophistication with the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans attempted tunneling beneath the walls, only for the defenders to dig counter-tunnels and intercept them mid-excavation, transforming the earth into a nightmarish knife fight. This defensive maneuver became known as countermining, and it introduced an unsettling dimension to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in absolute darkness, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, straining to hear the sounds of enemy picks. The moment they detected tapping, they would race to intercept, frequently resulting in violent, claustrophobic skirmishes fought by torchlight with knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, just terror, suffocation, and soil. But when undermining succeeded, the consequences were catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples occurred in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it ablaze. The supports gave way, causing the entire tower above to collapse. The defenders were stunned and soon after surrendered. By the 13th century, siege engineers became experts in identifying weak foundations, assessing soil behavior, and orchestrating collapses with horrifying precision. They were geologists and demolitionists combined. And although tunneling demanded time, labor, and a touch of madness, it proved one undeniable truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall, and you couldn't go through it, you could always bring it down from below. Not all the drama of siege warfare originated from the attackers. For every ram constructed or tower advanced, defenders possessed their own lethal stratagems. And sometimes those stratagems involved heat. Let's begin with the most terrifying of them all, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century CE, Greek fire was an enigmatic, napalm-like substance that adhered to ships, walls, and flesh, and continued to burn even on water. Sprayed from siphons or hurled in clay vessels, it unleashed scenes of absolute pandemonium. To this day, its exact composition remains unknown. The formula was so closely guarded that it perished with the empire, but its effects were legendary. Entire fleets were reduced to flaming wreckage within minutes. And that was merely the beginning. In more rudimentary defenses, boiling liquids were the preferred weapons. Boiling water, oil, or sand would be poured from murder holes, those quaint openings in the ceilings of gateways or towers, directly onto invaders below. Oil was particularly dreaded. Unlike water, it clung to skin, saturating clothes and armor before igniting. Imagine ascending a siege ladder only to be met with an unquenchable inferno. Hot sand, while less dramatic, was equally vicious. It would seep into the crevices of armor, particularly around the neck or wrists, inflicting second and third degree burns as it cooked the flesh beneath. It didn't appear impressive from a distance, but it transformed courageous warriors into screaming wrecks in seconds. Defenders also leveraged the fundamental laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Enormous stones, logs, or even animal carcasses were dropped from parapets onto siege engines or dense troop formations. The objective was not merely to kill, it was to incapacitate both machines and morale simultaneously. And then there were traps, concealed pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Castles became elaborate puzzles of pain, designed to impede, disorient, and punish. All of this served a singular purpose: delay. Every minute a wall held meant a minute closer to enemy supply lines dwindling, to disease spreading in camps, or to reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was a contest of attrition, and while the attackers had physics on their side, the defenders possessed ingenuity and an abundance of boiling rage. In siege warfare, outright destruction constituted only half the objective. The other half was psychological dominance, shattering the resolve of the defenders before the walls even succumbed. Siege weapons were not merely instruments of war. They were colossal, groaning, flaming harbingers of doom. Every creaking wheel of a siege tower, every arcing boulder flung by a trebuchet, was meticulously designed to implant one terrifying notion in the minds of those behind the walls: you are not secure. Ancient commanders understood this implicitly. The Assyrians openly paraded their siege engines, dragging them across deserts with grand spectacle. The Romans established their siege camps directly in view of the enemy, allowing defenders to witness the assembly of battering rams and the testing of catapults. Siege was a theatrical performance, and fear was an integral part of the script. Sometimes the projectiles themselves carried a message. Decapitated heads of messengers or generals would be launched over the walls, often still clad in their armor. At the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded not only with rocks but with bodies. Diseased corpses were launched to spread panic and pestilence. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it is believed that hurling plague-infected corpses over the walls contributed to outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet was not just a weapon, it was an announcement. When one of these giants was brought into position, everyone inside the fortress could hear it before they saw it. The creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thud of the counterweight, like the heartbeat of an approaching storm. But the most perilous aspect was the unknown. You never knew what would come next. Would it be a rock, a barrel of fire, a volley of arrows, or simply silence? An ominous, oppressive silence. As engineers adjusted their aim, even the sounds became psychological weapons. The rhythmic thud of a battering ram or the sudden stillness before a shot would drive defenders to distraction with anticipation. For commanders, the objective was to instill despair, to convince the enemy that resistance was futile, that their gods had forsaken them, that their walls were nothing more than temporary impediments in the face of destiny. And when that mental barrier finally fractured, the gates often yielded without a fight. Because in siege warfare, sometimes the mind capitulated before the masonry. As gunpowder dramatically altered the battlefield in the late medieval era, the age of traditional siege engines gradually drew to a close. Yet, their legacy did not vanish, it transformed. The advent of cannons changed everything. A single well-placed shot from a cannon could accomplish in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to achieve. Stone walls, once considered impregnable, became liabilities. By the 15th century, the grand castles of Europe were crumbling, not from undermining or fire, but from iron balls crashing through their parapets. Siege warfare had entered its next phase, explosive, brutal, and deafening. And yet, the principles established by ancient siege engineers never disappeared. Modern artillery still owes a debt to the catapult and trebuchet. Every ballistic missile and long-range howitzer is simply a high-tech evolution of the same fundamental question. How do you breach what is intended to be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, and force, all discovered, tested, and perfected centuries before gunpowder ever entered the narrative. Even contemporary military psychology, with its concepts of shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, and visible dominance, has its origins in ancient siege tactics. Those towering siege engines advancing with banners fluttering in the wind were the original shock and awe. They were not merely about breaching a wall. They were about breaking the spirit of a city. You can still discern their enduring influence etched into the ruins of ancient cities. At Marzada, where Roman siege ramps still mar the desert landscape. At Constantinople, where layers of walls stood for 1,000 years against every imaginable machine, until cannon fire finally brought them down. At castles across Europe, where circular towers and angled bastions recount the story of a world constantly adapting itself to survive the next siege. And today, even in a world of drones and satellite-guided missiles, siege warfare has not faded away. It has merely transitioned to the digital realm. Cities are still encircled. Defenders are still isolated. Walls are now firewalls, blockades, or even media blackouts. But the essence of the siege remains unchanged. Someone desires entry, someone desires to prevent them, and both are prepared to wait, construct, and conquer to achieve victory. The battering rams are gone. The trebuchets are museum exhibits. But the spirit of siege warfare, it is as vibrant and as destructive as ever.